The next time he woke, the draperies had been pulled back, and Podrick Payne stood over him with a candle. When he saw Tyrion open his eyes, he ran off. "No, don't go. Help me, help," he tried to call. But the best he could do was a muffled moan. "I have no mouth." He raised a hand to his face, his every movement pained and fumbling. His fingers found stiff cloth where they should have found flesh, lips, teeth. Linen. The lower half of his face was bandaged tightly, a mask of hardened plaster, with holes for breathing and feeding. Tyrion 15, A Clash of Kings. Tyrion Lannister's greatest gift in A Song of Ice and Fire is his quick tongue, which, depending on the situation, can be his greatest gift or his biggest downfall. It saved him from death at some times, and at other times it made enemies with kings, queens, and slavers. But according to a certain theory, he may lose the only real gift he has in the world, condemned to knowing some damning secrets, but never being able to speak them. The quote I read earlier is a preview of this idea, and a reference to the short story by Harlan Ellison, "I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream." We know that Martin was friends with Ellison through a blog post he wrote after Ellison's death. With how familiar he was with Ellison, it's extremely likely that Martin had read Ellison's most popular work, and that this line is a reference to it. While it might seem like a one-off reference, I think that it hints at a potential ending for Tyrion's character, as well as some other major plot points in the future. Ted, the protagonist of the story, is a somewhat sympathetic but unreliable narrator who slips into insanity as the story goes on. This is already pretty similar to Tyrion's character, but there's more. At the end of the story, after all the other humans are killed, Ted is the only one left alive, to be tortured by the artificial intelligence named Am. Ted is morphed into a motionless blob of flesh, unable to do anything, except experience the infinite torture that Am afflicts upon him. While Tyrion probably won't turn into a mortal flesh ball in the story, the idea of losing one's ability to speak and desperately needing to convey something is actually a pretty common theme in the Song of Ice and Fire. In my Ill and Pain video, I theorized that he had his tongue taken out by Tywin, so he couldn't spread the secret that Aerys had gotten Joanna pregnant, and Jaime and Cersei are not Tywin's children. With Ill and Pain being unable to otherwise read or write, he'd be trapped with a secret for years, suffering with the knowledge that if only he could convey it, all hell would break loose. But when he trains with Jaime and hears about his incestuous relationship with Cersei, all he does is laugh. From the confirmation that he is indeed a Targaryen, and the knowledge that he, too, has world-shattering information that he hides away, Ill and Pain can't help but feel a sick sense of ironic pleasure. But if this example relies on too many unknown factors, there are many other examples of this theme among different characters. Marillion the Singer has his tongue taken out by Littlefinger after he's framed for Lysa Arryn's murder. This alone is enough of a connection, but we can take it a step further and make more connections to Ilyn's story. It's very likely that Marillion is upon a Littlefinger, given a strange set of coincidences in his actions. When he and Catelyn spot Tyrion, he's the one to get his attention and instigate a conflict between the two. He then travels to the Eyrie, which is a convenient location for a spy to keep tabs on Lysa in the trial. Finally, him taking the fall would keep suspicion away from Littlefinger. When he appears again after his arrest, it is in bandages that hide his eyes and fingers, though we're told that he lost his sight in 3 of his fingers. Marillion, by contrast, looked almost elegant. Someone had bathed him and dressed him in a pair of sky blue breeches and a loose-fitting white tunic, with puffed sleeves, belted with a silvery sash that had been a gift from Lady Lysa. White silk gloves covered his hands, while a white silk bandage spared the lords the sight of his eyes. Sansa 1, A Feast for Crows. It's more likely that these injuries are being staged, and Marillion's perfectly fine and still serving Littlefinger as a spy. Though his tongue is intact, he's still clued on the major information about Littlefinger's schemes, dating all the way back to the start of the War of the Five Kings. All this time, he's had to keep his mouth shut, with the symbol of the tongue being cut out still being used. As for both Marillion and Ilyn Payne having major information about their superiors, which they aren't allowed to say, we'll come back to that. In Tyrion's case, the theory of his tongue being taken out works as a parallel to Jaime and Cersei's arcs. Martin in general likes to take a character's most significant attribute and remove it to see what lies beneath. But in the Lannisters' cases, this is the most evident. Jaime loses the hand that defined his role as a Kingsguard, and Cersei loses the beauty that defined her role as the Queen. It would make sense for Tyrion's character to lose the tongue that defines him, and see the madness behind his witty exterior. This would also be extremely ironic, given how many times people mention cutting his tongue out. We know Martin loves his dark irony, especially with the Lannisters. Tyrion despises his father, but still respects him to a certain point, and tries to replicate his strategy of cunning and trickery. Tyrion famously tells Jon to own up to his insecurity, that he should accept being a bastard and wear it with pride. Tyrion himself, though, is extremely insecure about his dwarfism, and lets other people's perception of him drive him to insanity all the time. The dark irony would perfectly culminate in Tyrion being tongueless and insane, being reduced to the mad dwarf everyone thought he was. But for this to work, this would likely have to be at the end of the story, and I can think of a certain scenario that would explain it. One factor that could lead to this outcome is the potential of contracting grayscale. It's pretty under-discussed how Tyrion was drowned in a river full of grayscale zombies and drank a ton of the water, and the other person with him also contracted grayscale. While Jon Connington may have grayscale at the extremities, there's another way this disease can spread. Tyrion drove the dagger's point into the ball of his thumb, watched the blood bead up, sucked it away. How long must I continue to torture myself? When will we be certain that I'm clean? Truly, said the half-minister, never. You swallowed half the river. You may be going gray even now, turning to stone from inside out, starting with your heart and lungs. If so, pricking your toes and bathing in vinegar will not save you. It seems unlikely that Martin would bring up this plot point without ever developing on it. If Tyrion were to contract grayscale, and if his tongue were cut out, he'd have no way to stop the disease from turning into a pandemic, especially if this happened after he returns to Westeros. He also wouldn't be able to write either, since this would contaminate the page. Slowly going mad, spreading a deadly disease, these all seem like the recipe for a tragic ending to Tyrion's character. But that's just one possible answer to the why. We can look back at Ellison's story to find the how. The one responsible for Ted's cruel torture is Am, a supercomputer AI who destroys most of the world and tortures the few surviving humans. While a supercomputer would be out of place in A Song of Ice and Fire, we know that Martin likes to combine sci-fi elements into his fantasy world, given his past as a sci-fi writer. The Dune series, for example, is a major influence on A Song of Ice and Fire, and in the Dune universe, humans with magic powers are used to replicate supercomputers. If these connections are true, we'll need a human supercomputer to become enemies with Tyrion. My guess is that Bran Stark will play this role. The idea that Bran Stark will become an all-knowing hive mind is a pretty common one, but I'll quickly go over it for those who don't know. Bran's training with Bloodraven seems to be leading him down a darker and darker path, and he's likely being manipulated to serve some greater purpose. Bloodraven in his human life was rumored to be a sorcerer who watched over the kingdom with 1,000 eyes. If he wanted to continue like this beyond his death, he could install Bran as a puppet into royal politics and manipulate the world from the shadows. To see how this will play out, we can take a look back in history to find the parallels to the future endgame of the story. We're told from the first line of the story, quote, "We should start back," meaning to look what's happened before to see what's yet to come. The Hour of the Wolf from the Dance of the Dragons seems like a prime example of this, especially since the original title of the final novel was The Time for Wolves. The Hour of the Wolf was a conclusive ending to the Dance of the Dragons, where Cregan Stark arrived at King's Landing after Aegon III's coronation to serve as the Hand of the King and carry out revenge with his armies. He personally executed many key figures such as Corlys Velaryon and multiple Kingsguard to put an end to the war and get retribution on the Greens. If Bran replicated Cregan's actions in the story, he might have a similar outcome. It's likely that the ending of the series will be just as chaotic and messy as the Dance of the Dragons, with not only multiple Targaryens competing for the Iron Throne, but many other contenders to deal with, as well as the aftermath of the Long Night. Bran coming down from the north, controlled by Bloodraven and determined to gain power, could easily find a way to establish control in the chaos and serve justice wherever he deems fit. This would be a much more interesting way to spin the ending of the show with Bran as king, as well as many other plot points. Jon Snow's exile to the north would be a harsh sentencing of a brother, rather than the pointless gesture to Grey Worm it was in the show. And who knows how many characters would meet their end when Bran decides to pass his sentencing with his own blade, just like Ned Stark taught him. Tyrion, however, would be deemed too dangerous to be allowed to speak, leading to the cruel and ironic fate of being sentenced to silence. But as you remember, Marillion and Ilyn Payne were silent servants of a leader, as well as Varys' birds and Euron's mute crew. If all the silent characters are subordinates of the one who took their tongue, it may be possible that Tyrion could end up somehow subservient to Bran. But how or why, I don't know.